So good afternoon, everyone. I'm Helen Gubbins, and I'm from the music department at the University of Sheffield. And it's lovely to be here with you today and to be giving this talk on my early doctoral research. So I'm going to be talking to you today about my research on the mediation of music by radio historically. And I'm going to highlight 5 things we can learn about music from the history of radio. So radio stations have been key sites for cultural production and debate internationally from their beginnings in the early 20th century. We may all agree that media today are vastly different from media in the 1920s when they first began, but radio is still a relatively ubiquitous technology. So if you grew up with a radio in your house, chances are there is still a radio of some type in your home today. A good historical sense of what media were like back in the earliest decades still provides us with important insights about how mass media became what they are now and why. For this reason, radio recordings are unique measures of historical development and change in many spheres of our social and cultural life. And as it is so primarily an oral medium, the radio is an especially valuable place to study musical activity and history. So the formats of radio broadcasts remained relatively unchanged over the years. And so radio recordings can provide us with longitudinal data about certain types of musical activity over a long period of time, several decades sometimes. As a growing amount of research on radio shows, radio does indeed follow conventions and patterns which themselves are products of global and national culture. So if we're looking for a continuous historical source of many varied types of musical activities, and if we're looking to find out about the conditions and conventions affecting the performance and reception and meeting of musical activities and practices over the years, the radio is a very good place to start. For example, on Radio Éireann, the Irish public broadcaster, in 1946, programs in the category of music made up 45% of the total broadcast time. And if you add in the advertising, which was described as mainly music, and children's music programming, that figure jumped to 60%. And when we do look at radio broadcasts, we find that they had a huge impact on certain musical activities and traditions. For example, in my brief research, I looked at the earliest decades of Irish traditional music on RTE. I identified some changes that occurred in that music that we could specifically trace back to the influence of radio broadcasts. So first, performing on radio in the earliest decades meant that musicians were placed under a spotlight, becoming famous within their musical communities and farther afield instantly. Second, when one musician was singled out as being worthy for broadcast on the national radio, this brought great excitement for them and great opportunities for teaching and playing locally. But it brought bitter disappointment for their musician neighbour if they were not picked for broadcast. So the musical hierarchies in a community were very much influenced by radio broadcasts, in Ireland anyway. Third, the radio made more tunes accessible to listening musicians, thus expanding the repertoire nationally. Fourth, the listening musician came under pressure to learn more tunes and quickly. So in this way, the impact of early radio was different to that of early gramophone records, for example, because it was ephemeral and it happened and then it was gone. One fiddle player that I spoke to told me that the first tape recorder he got was in the early 60s, and before that he had to just try and learn the tunes as quickly as possible from the radio as they were broadcast, and he had to just remember them after that. So the challenge for him of radio was that it really pushed players to sharpen their dictation skills. And fifth, radio introduced musicians to one another. So another important change made by the radio that keeps coming up in my research over and over again is that musicians were first introduced to one another over the radio when they might never have met otherwise. Often they'd be excited to meet these musicians on a later occasion at a festival or other musical event, having already gotten to know a little about them on the radio. And changes occurring in regional styles were hastened with the arrival of the radio simply because listening musicians began to hear the music of different musicians around the country and farther afield, and they began to adapt their playing styles to be more like each other. So there are 5 small examples of how looking at radio history can help to explain developments and changes in one particular musical tradition over a period of time. So in addition to the impact of radio itself on musical activities, when we look at the history of radio, we can clearly see conventions and patterns which themselves are products of broader national and global culture. And we can see how strong societal norms are replicated in its output. For example, gender imbalances in musical activity come starkly to the fore in the history of Irish radio. If we look at a list of recordings of choral music in the RTE archive from 1926 to 1990, the archive had stored 276 recordings of choral music by Irish composers. Out of these 276 recordings, only 10 were composed by women. That is less than 4% of those recordings. So these are choral compositions by Irish composers held in the RTE archives, and up until 1990. I just looked at one section at a time. So these are those 10 recordings composed by women. So there are many possible reasons, of course, why this was the case. Gender imbalances are not unique to Ireland, to choral music, nor to music in general. But looking at this, just one subsection of the musical activity tells us that in choral music in Ireland, up until 1990 at least, female composers were mostly absent when it came to broadcasting. We can clearly see how women have historically been socialised out of musical composition in Ireland in a way. So this contributes to an explanation, and it's not the whole explanation, but it does contribute to an explanation of why women continue to be underrepresented in positions of authority in musical activities today, even though our socio-cultural environment is, of course, vastly different from 1990 even, not to mind before that. A fourth overall part of musical knowledge that we can learn about from looking at radio is how important the production context was for the music performed. For example, in the earliest decades of radio broadcasting, sometimes a studio set up with its microphones and cables strewn all around made some musicians nervous, and it severely affected how they played on air. Musicians with experience of playing with microphones, which were huge machines in the earliest decades, were the musicians with experience of playing with those, say, with professional activity, and this applied to people mostly based in the big urban areas like Dublin or Cork. They were vastly more comfortable with the broadcast experience, and then musicians from primarily early rural areas who hadn't huge experience of playing with microphones or dealing with technology and dealing with how to get the best sound out of your performance. So they were severely disadvantaged then when it came to broadcast opportunities, and therefore got less work. This was due to geographical reasons as well, because there was less money to pay for expenses. But all of these things, taken over several decades, conditions like these thus affect our narratives of musical histories in that era, and they affect the cross-section of musicians that got to play on this national radio that I was focusing on. And finally, my current doctoral research explores a question in general of musical mediation and how musical communities and traditions respond to this over time. It also thinks a little bit about how music is affected by technology in general. So while I focus on one particular technology from a long time ago, the radio, I am also interested in the broader significance of this for how technology changes our experience and our learning and our communities of music that we have nowadays. So with each new technology that comes across. So today I spoke about 5 things we can learn about the history of music in general, and 5 things about one specific musical tradition, Irish traditional music, from the history of radio. And those are just some of the unique ways we can think about and rethink about music and its historical narratives when we focus on the medium of radio. So thank you very much.